Continuing debate, the honourable member for York Simcoe.
Lake Simcoe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be sharing my time with the honourable member from Brandon, Surrey. I'm glad we're having this debate this evening. It's a very important issue, and it's necessary to address the growing sentiment that exists right here across this great country. Canadians are frustrated, Mr. Speaker. They're sick and tired. Constant shutdowns, lockdowns, restrictions, mandates are having a terrible toll on our country's population. This toll is now becoming far beyond that of COVID-19 itself. After 2 years, we know that COVID-19 is not going away. That's why we have to use all the tools at our disposal so that Canadians can live healthy, normal lives and businesses can reopen. Unfortunately, the Liberal government has failed in its handling of the pandemic, and now they are failing to provide Canadians with a credible plan to get life back to normal. Even as countries around the world drop their restrictions and mandates, even as they put forward plans to help their citizens learn to live with COVID, the federal Liberal government persists with policies and practices here in Canada that no longer make sense. Over 90% of the population has been vaccinated already, and we know that vaccines have limited utility in preventing the transmission of the Omicron variant. Instead of putting forth a credible plan, the Liberals continue to sow division and resentment among Canadians. They ignore the widening gap between those on guaranteed government salaries, like themselves, and those who are only able to work if the government lets them. There is a widening gap between those who live in rural Canada and everyone else. A gap between low-income workers and those at the very top. Between homeowners and renters, and the haves and the have-nots. It's no wonder Canadians are angry and frustrated. It's no wonder that after 2 years, that frustration has led to one of the most significant protests Parliament Hill has ever seen. The Freedom Convoy of trucks and other vehicles that has assembled outside from coast to coast. They are here at Parliament, as is their right, protesting the policies of the federal government. They are doing this outside the federal building and protesting provincial policies outside legislative buildings across the country. I would note, Mr. Speaker, that this is the appropriate place to do that. They aren't outside private homes or cottages of MPs or premiers' homes. The Prime Minister may not want to speak to those protesters, but I have, Mr. Speaker. I've spoken to many of them. I've read their signs and listened to what they are saying. And one thing is abundantly clear. It's not just the protesters outside in the provincial capitals across the country who have these so-called unacceptable views. These views are not held by some fringe minority. I've heard these opinions from my own constituents. Canadians from all walks of life have real concerns about how the Liberals have handled this pandemic, and want to know what the government is doing to put COVID-19 behind us. Instead of addressing these concerns, the Prime Minister, his government, and some in the mainstream media have labelled them as racist, misogynist, extremist, just to avoid scrutiny for the Liberal government's numerous failures. Unlike the Prime Minister, I believe the most important job I have as an elected representative is to listen to the residents of my community, just as it is his job supposed to listen to the citizens of this great country. Over the past few weeks, I've heard from the owner of a local gym in Bradford, 9 Round, who was in tears. She has been shut down so many times, she can't even count. She now owes thousands of dollars in rent with no relief available to her, and no confidence that anything will be changing anytime soon. I've heard from an elderly man in Keswick who is eligible for no COVID-19 support and forced to eat Kraft dinner now, 5 days a week for supper, because he can't afford to buy proper groceries as inflation continues to rise. He told me, Mr. Speaker, he never thought his retirement would look like this. I've heard from a couple in Jackson's Point who returned from a cruise near Egypt, only to be locked up in a quarantine hotel for days on end. with no clothes and no access to life-saving medication. I've heard from families in Mount Albert who experienced the pain of losing a loved one to COVID-19, and seniors in Sutton who have been isolated in long-term care homes and other facilities for the past 2 years without the ability to see their families or the outside world. I've heard an expected single mother in Holland Landing who provided for her family through her job in a federally regulated industry. She was fired because she made the decision that she wanted to wait to get vaccinated after she had her child. I've heard from parents in Bondhead whose son hasn't been to school in 18 months, Mr. Speaker. Every single one of these people has real stories, valid concerns about where our country is after 2 years of COVID-19. Many Canadians are hurting right now. Many have lost their jobs, they've lost friends and families, and lost faith in their government and institutions. And Mr. Speaker, they deserve to be heard. My constituents in York, Simcoe, and Canadians across the country have diligently followed public health advice, made sacrifices, done what's necessary to keep their families and communities safe throughout this pandemic. They have done their part. Now it's time for the Liberal government to do their part. It's time for a re-examination of the government's COVID-19 response and a more sustainable path that gets life back to normal and gives Canadians hope for the future. What does that path look like? It's clear that more must be done to ensure that those most vulnerable are protected as best we can from the coronavirus. But that can be done without devastating and ineffective lockdowns and mandates that cripple the economy and impact the lives and livelihoods of Canadians. I spent most of my life working as a restaurateur. I know the challenges and triumphs that exist in the industry. It can be hard to make ends meet and keep your doors open in the best of times. But when the government has shut you down and prevented patrons from coming in, it's no wonder many have closed their door for its good. Instead, we need to be looking at alternative policy approaches that will keep Canadians safe while strengthening our economy and respecting individual freedoms. In summer of 2020, my colleagues and I in the Ontario Conservative Caucus were criticized by state media, the Liberals, and the NDP for examining an innovative rapid test that Health Canada had not approved after months of delays, despite being available in the US and across Europe. We were looking for solutions and to hold the government account so it could be the best it could be. But instead of addressing the prolonged delays at Health Canada, and instead of looking at best practices of other countries, government members opted to criticize, ridicule, and ignore. That's why it's no surprise those same rapid tests, and many like it, are still hard to come by for most Canadians today, 2 years later. But it's not just rapid tests. We need better medical approaches that focus on treating those who are suffering from COVID, not just fruitlessly trying to stop its transmission. Right now, we have some of the worst healthcare capacity in the G7, and our system will remain strained because of delayed surgeries and other procedures. Where's the plan for that, Mr. Speaker? Where's the funding for the provinces? But no matter what is done to specifically address COVID-19 going forward, one fact remains. Most of us hate to see the country as the state it's in today. It's hurt and it has divided us. That's why it's important that we restore a sense of unity in Canada, a shared commitment to one another. It's time to put aside the divisive rhetoric and policies and politics that drive wedges between neighbours, family members, and friends. There needs to be a recognition that we are all in this together once more as we look towards a future. This is what our country needs, and it requires the right kind of leadership to make this happen. Canadians are telling us that they want this Parliament and they want it to work together while representing every part of this country and the people who live here. And they are telling us they want to see a government that is committed to collaboration, accommodation, and a willingness to listen. Mr. Speaker, I hope the Prime Minister is listening.
Question and comment, questions and comments. We're going to go to Zoom. The Honourable Member for Kings Hands.
Thank you,